will bring everyone back together so that we can start the webinar back up. And then Chris message, so take a peek at that when you have a chance.
I'm sorry, what did you say, Brooke?
I said I'm going to shoot you a direct message as well, so
okay.
take a peek when you have a chance.
Great. Okay, I think we have spent enough time on shared responsibility matrices or CRMs, and please just, the takeaway is you're looking for details, guys. Your assessment is riding on the details. Here's the new definition for a cloud service provider. This is the ubiquitous term. An ESP is considered a cloud service provider when it provides its own cloud services based on a model for enabling ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing, etc. Something that can be rapidly provisioned. This is what you would commonly think of. I go online and I order it and I have it. I'm able to download it that day. That's a CSP. If you are not in using a service that falls underneath that definition, thankfully, it no longer needs to be FedRAMP authorized. DFARS, clause 7012, is where they say, hey, you must meet the FedRAMP requirements or equivalent of DFARS 7012 if you're using a CSP. And note that ESPs that are CSPs and process, store, transmit CUI. That's what we're talking about here. If they do not process, store, transmit CUI, now they're not required to be FedRAMP authorized. Another note about cloud service providers: if you are relying on an equivalency, and I said this earlier, beware. It may not be there. So, hey, my company that I'm using said they're equivalent. They have this, what they have to go do is get a letter of attestation that says, yeah, they're doing everything that's required by FedRAMP. That may not be good enough at some point. And so beware of those that went down the equivalency path.
And to add to that, it's a time in space. So a equivalent provider might have been 100% equivalent yesterday, but could have an incident that makes them not 100% tomorrow. And depending on when your assessment is and that evidence is provided, could cause you to lose your assessment because something has changed on their end. This actually happened recently on a JSVA with a provider writing on that.
Yep, failed assessment. They were using a service that 12 times in a row passed a CMMC JSVA. 13th time, the assessor, and this was the DoD, the assessor said, no, they're not doing it. I don't see enough information here to say that they're FedRAMP equivalent. Fail the assessment. Huge stakes, guys. So we've talked about this. All assessors now are even more valuable because we need 3 of them for every single assessment. That means, I think, better assessments. There are lots of people with great minds out there, but having 3 sets of people looking at the same stuff is going to ensure you've got a better result. And that's just assessors. You also have CCPs that are on the team often. One thing to keep in mind, there are 2 classifications of people that can be on an assessment. And I think that also guides who you want to hire to help guide you through this process. CCPs and CCAs, that's it. Certified CMMC professionals and certified CMMC assessors are the only 2 entities that are allowed to walk in and perform an assessment. There are a lot of people out there who will tell you that they know a lot about CMMC, and I have unfortunately, we've seen clients come to us and say, this guy wants to offer us services in the CMMC space. They weren't even pointing to the right framework. They were using a different NIST framework. It's unbelievable, the people who are out there trying to peddle services because they know the contractors are panicking right now. Wait, we got to get certified. Who are we going to use? Everybody's become an expert. You must make sure that these people are trained by the DoD. That's what all CCPs and CCAs, they have to go through training that the DoD approved through an instructor that the DoD has already approved and trained themselves. And then they've passed both a CCP and a background check. So that's required for anybody who enters into this space. And then the CCAs go a step further and do further training, another 40-hour class. And these tests, as everybody here can attest to, they're not easy. It definitely narrows down the pool. But because of these higher requirements, there are fewer to go around. And they, again, as Daniel said, increase the requirements in the new rule. The lead assessors, oh, now you need to go have a certification. Before they were saying you have to have a college degree or equivalent that's in cybersecurity or equivalent. They just said, go get certified. Here's what the certification should look like. And the same thing applies for both lead and just any assessor on the team. So what does this mean for you? Yeah, it's going to be more expensive. But again, the goal here is to make it better quality. We also are seeing the wait times that I spoke of earlier, a year in the case of some C3PAOs before they can even schedule you to get an assessment. And we've said this in a few different ways. Just be careful when you pick your MSP and ESP. These services are falling into scope that does become part of your assessment. And just like the primes are responsible for everybody underneath them, you as an OSA are responsible for everybody you're using as an ESP. So your assessment can fail based on the choices you make here. Consider the certified ESPs. And I always think if these ESPs are trained internally, and we've seen a lot of MSPs are coming in for that training. If they're trained internally, they're going to be able to help you better than anybody. So you're looking for specifically ESPs that have specialized in, hey, we got this whole division that we focus on CMMC, and we trained our people to be that good. We've spoke about this as well. Contractors, you're probably going to hear from your prime first before you're going to have a contract that comes available with the DoD, but go get certified and bid on these contracts because the pool just got super small. It might be a single applicant or respondent to these opportunities from the DoD that is certified. So this is your time to shine. This is another thing. The DoD has stated, we're not going to keep a database of certifications. Yes, it exists, but they're not tracking that. They're not releasing it. So when you get certified, your prime doesn't know that. You got to tell them. And you'll get a certification from your C3PAO. But you got to tell everybody. That's going to change your business tremendously. Daniel put in the rule requirements for CCP and CCA. Thanks, Daniel. Okay, what can you do? And we want to open this up with the JSVA. We've learned from a number of people who have sat for JSVAs already. We've heard a lot from DIBCAC. And I know that Ozzy, you've been in how many JSVAs that you sat in personally?
5. We've been involved in 5.
That is such invaluable insight. What can you tell us that you've learned and you've seen?
Yeah, sure. So let's say our first one was completed in May of 23. And since then, we've had exposure to 3 different C3PAOs. And we've stuck, the first one that we went through, we stuck with that one 2 more times. And then we had clients who had other C3PAOs, and there were 2 different ones. But first thing that I noticed off the jump was that there was variances in their approach, right? And what I mean by that is variances from their process specifics, like when it gets into the nitty-gritty details of how they create the week plan for the assessment, how they conduct the scoping conversation, and how they're examining or testing controls. The other variance that we've noticed, which is that we've had instances where a specific implementation approach worked for one C3PAO just fine, but then for another, it did not. And that to me was very scary to see, because it's like, if we can't agree to some minimum level of criteria, and I understand how difficult that is, because if we look at 320 objectives, and for each one you could say there's 1,000 ways to skin that cat, right? There's so many possibilities, right? And the problem is assessors need to do a good job of maintaining a level of unbiased approach and neutrality, so that way they don't bring their opinions to the table. That's where I was cautious, folks, is that as you're looking at evaluating C3PAOs, not just understanding their technical aptitude, but understanding their process even, right? How they are quoting you, how they are scoping your quote, right? Understand the details of how they get that information to generate a proposal, right? That'll give you insight into how detailed they will be during the assessment. And I say detailed is better. Some would think, well, now they're going to drill me even harder on things. No, it's actually better because they're at least up front and center with expectations. Now you can manage your response to that, right? So if, in my opinion, as you're evaluating them, make sure you're also asking them questions, right? And saying, hey, what's your perspective on a control? Like, pick a hard control and just ask them, what would be your perspective on this control? Like, what would you think is a good solution for this? As part of your evaluation, right? Before you select them and sign a contract. And if you see that they're bringing opinions on what's minimum criteria, and they're not saying, like, I always tell folks, the best answer somebody in information technology could give you is that depends. That's always the best answer. And if they say that depends, that's signifying that they're flexible, that they understand there's 1,000 ways to do this. There's not one perfect way. But if they give you specific examples and they can describe what that solution looks like, be cautious, because if they bring those examples to the table and say, well, this is my opinion on what's minimally necessary, it's very dangerous. And we did experience that. In one JSVA, we had the C3PO bringing past performance experience to the table from a completely different framework and standard outside of CMMC. And they're saying, well, what I've seen is minimally sufficient is this. And I'm like, according to what? and you can always tell them, point back to the assessment guides, point back to the rule. There's nothing in there that says that's what's minimum, right? And so it's a double-edged sword, but just be cautious. Do not let them bring opinions to the table, right? Let them simply focus on evaluating you in an unbiased standpoint and not bringing solutions, because that's consulting and is direct conflict of interest, right? They cannot consult. An assessor just says, yeah, I believe you're doing the minimum, right? That's all they can do is agree or disagree. And that's where assessors get cautious about when you ask, well, why do you disagree? And they're like, well, I don't want to get into consulting, right? And if they say things like that, even in your evaluation, that's a good thing, right? Hire them, because they totally understand that, right?
Yep.
So that's my suggestion is again, focusing on their approach to things. We had one JSVA where I really enjoyed this, and this is the one that I used, 3 times over, and I still keep sending clients their way, is I really liked this approach that they had, in which, as part of the quoting process, not only did they have a questionnaire, but they also had a scoping call scheduled, right? So they say, okay, we're going to do a scoping call that's then going to depict our ability to call DIBCAC and get you on the schedule. And so after they sign the contract, the OSA, they put a down deposit, they then schedule the scoping call with just the C3PO. And what the C3PO said is, give me your SSP. I'm not going to read it in detail, right? I'm going to just make sure that there's a statement for all 320 objectives. And it's not like a very short statement, like go see access control policy for all of the AC controls, right? It's got to be descriptive. I'm not going to read all of them. I'm just going to quickly skim through it. And where they focused their energy and attention was the narrative around the system diagram that depicts the scope of the boundary and the narrative around the CUI data flow diagram. And what they ended up doing is rewriting that narrative in their own language and redrawing those two diagrams in a really crappy paint tool. But what I really enjoyed about that is they then briefed us on their depiction where they redrew our diagrams and rewrote our descriptions. And then they said, am I right or am I wrong? And then we find, oh, actually, you're missing this key point here. You mistake this. That's an opportunity for you guys to get on the same exact page on scope so that during the week of the assessment, there is no additional questions or scope creep happening. And I thought that was brilliant. So again, pay attention to the processes of how they evaluate what your needs are and give you a quote.
Awesome advice. One of the things we recommend to our clients is, and we will make the recommendations if you like, but at least consider 3 C3 PAOs out there. Interview them. Don't go just for the cheapest one. I mean, there may be occasions where you have to pick one because they have availability and the other 2 aren't available for another year. But I like to consider several because you do need to have a relationship with them. They're going to show you the kind of work that they do, and you want them to be very good at what they do, but also can't emphasize it enough. What Ozzy said, there are so many ways to accomplish compliance. If they have an opinion before they walk in on how you need to be, run.
And to add to that is ask questions of everyone who's going to be on that assessment team of what their experience in what fields, because this is more than just cybersecurity. This is a holistic data security program. Where is it physically? How is your site set up to protect information? And if they don't have specific industry experience with something you do, you may not want to consider them because it may take a lot of time for them to understand what you do to make sure that you're adequately protecting the data. So that is another consideration that I think is very important.
Big choice, but it's an awesome thing that we have a choice. Choose your 3 PAOs wisely. Same thing applies to your consultants along the way. If you choose a assessment team or a group that has assessors in it, they will not be able to sit on your assessment. That is in our code of professional conduct. We can't both advise and do the evaluation, do the assessment. And that's why, as Ozzy said, a good C3 PAO will tell you at the assessment stage, I can't give you guidance. That would preclude them from being your assessor. So an assessment is purely, I'm going to look under the hood and see if it's compliant on that day, but I can't tell you how to go do it. On the other side, your guides, find an assessor, find somebody who has some experience out there to guide you, because that's what you want. You want somebody who thinks like an assessor, who has the experience, has all that training to get you there so that they know I'm going to hand you off to somebody who thinks similarly. And that's what we've tried to network and find our own. C3 PAOs, and Ozzy has some as well, that these are ones that we like the way they think. We know that they are looking at this the right way. And it's not a, roll the dice. ESPs, we talked about that, so important. So these are some decisions you guys have in the coming months, if not already. You need to choose wisely. Collect evidence. Ozzy talked about this, but you need to start. What we don't want to see as assessors is we come in and you threw this together last week, because what are the chances of you staying compliant? We want to see that this is a pattern. This is a mindset your company has been. It's new to everybody. We know you weren't doing CMMC 5 years ago, but we want to see that you've established a model at your company of this is how we protect data. Highly recommend getting assessed early. And then this is part of the requirements. You have to stay compliant in between. These assessments are every 3 years if you're getting level 2 or level 3. But every year you have to self-attest that you're still doing it. And if anything happens, you're going to have to go get assessed again. That changes your security system. For example, hey, we acquired a new division. and they came over to our company. Well, guess what? You're probably going to have to be assessed again. So those are some things that can come up in between that may change your compliance, and you'll need to consider that.
And the rule does have a comment from the DoD specifically on what kind of things constitute a need for a reevaluation sooner than 3 years versus not.
I also put a nice guide for choosing a C3PAO in the chat. Not only are we looking at other agencies, this is going around the world, guys. So we've spoken to a lot of our partners in Canada that have seen Canada jump on this right away. Something very important happened early on in the process when the DoD had version 1.0 of CMMC. The DoD went into what the requirements were from NIST and added 20 more. And Canada was one of the first countries to step up and say, you're going to mess with it, mess with what we all consider a standard from NIST and add your own stuff. We can't be a part of that. We're not going to do that. So DoD, in part because of that, and it was confusing, they pulled out those extra 20 requirements in CMMC 2.0. And it became just the 110 controls currently, and that's changing soon. Currently, there are 110 controls in NIST 171. Canada said, we'll sign up for that too. We'll do NIST 171, we'll do CMMC, they called it CPCSC. UK is signed up, and most of these other countries are not as progressed as Canada is, but they have said, mostly through memorandums of understanding, yes, we're on the same path. And notably, these are all partners of ours. So they all know that they do business with us. Many of them we have subcontractors in Canada, UK, Israel, Japan. I just went to the AUSA show, which is Army's biggest trade show. Israel, UK, Japan, they all had entire sections of the floor with all their contractors. So they're all looking for doing business with us. Therefore, this is going to get really big. This is something that I sat across from a major prime 3-4 years ago, early on in the process, who said CMMC is never going to happen. Yeah, it's happened. It's going global with all of our partners and with other federal agencies. So this is something that it's a big choice. I know it's going to be expensive for a lot of people, but I think it's a wise choice if you're doing any of this. So yeah, Daniel brings up Canada, interestingly said, well, NIST just came out with revision 3. We're just going to adopt that. So there are some wrinkles as we're all getting on the CMMC boat that Canada leapfrogged ahead of us and said, we're going to do revision 3, where the US said, look, that would just make a mess out of things if we adopt revision 3 of 171 right now. So the DoD affirmatively said, they changed the rule actually. It used to say whatever version of 171 it is. They flat out said, no, we're using revision 2 for CMMC for now until further notice. How long will that be? We don't know, but speculate a year-ish, and then they'll probably flip it to revision 3 because remember those 20 additional controls that they added on, revision 3 pulls a lot of them in. So it's a more difficult framework, a little bit more difficult to get compliance, but it's better and it covers the supply chain. So DoD knows that they want to go there. They just didn't want to complicate the adoption of CMMC by throwing out 171 revision 2. Okay. We hear this a lot. Man, small businesses, we can't compete. And just keep in mind, we think you can. And in fact, there are opportunities here. Small businesses are 74% of the DIB. The DoD thinks on average, this is according to their own estimates, that a small business will spend about $105,000 per assessment period. That's every 3 years. SBA already weighed in on this, so there's nothing we can do through SBA. This is just something that it's critical enough to the security of the country. The DoD said everybody's got to do it, regardless of size. But let us give you some support. Here's APEX Accelerators, of course, here to support you for free in so many ways. Also, they came up with a Project Spectrum. another thing that the DIB can use for free to get tools for CMMC. They also have this Office of Small Business and Technology Partnership. Look into that. And then keep in mind that the DoD's most common response is, guys, didn't you already self-attest that you're doing this anyway? What are you crying about? You already said you were there. So for all these reasons, small businesses, the DoD feels they've helped you enough. And come to us. One of the things we like to do is for small businesses specifically, let's make it a budgeted thing. Let's make it so that it's fixed. We don't have to worry about, oh my gosh, I got a surprise. This is going to cost, $10,000 more than I thought. We think, and we associate with a lot of other assessors that think similarly about this, that we can help out small businesses, and yes, there's a cost, but let's do it in a way that is predictable. One more time on self-attestations, every company is going to have to do this. You have to self-attest if you're a contractor, period. Level 1, 2, or 3, you're still self-attesting. What is that? They want an executive level, somebody at the top on behalf of the company to say, this is what we're doing, but this is where false claims comes in. We already looked at this. Just keep in mind, the DoD is not playing around anymore. They feel that they've been lied to too much in this compliance process. That's why we're here. So if you're going to self-attest, don't just blindly say, yeah, I'm pretty sure my team is doing this. This is critical, and the DoD will do something about it. You need to know your information system. You need to know what your people are doing and confirm before signing anything. This is written into the rule. You can lose 3 times the amount that the contract was valued at. You could be barred permanently from any contracts with the federal government. There's prison time. Best practices in our mind, listen to your employees. This is where Boeing gets in trouble with whistleblowers, and Boeing whistleblowers get in trouble and somehow accidents happen, but listen to your employees. Take action when you hear, hey, this is something that I don't think is compliant.
And to add to this, literally yesterday, the Pennsylvania State whistleblower received a $250,000 share of the $1.25 million that Pennsylvania State is paying back to the government for not meeting their requirements.
So whistleblowers have incentives, guys. Just listen to your employees. We've talked about this. Just want to put it in your slide deck. It is a situation that is changing. So as it stands right now, there is a FedRAMP equivalency. In this memo that they released, again, authored by David McCune, you have to be 100% compliant. Why would they say that? If you go through the FedRAMP process and you're sponsored, is what they call it, by an agency, you don't have to be 100% compliant. The agency can actually say, well, I'm pretty comfortable with, you did 90% of the controls, for example. They're okay with that. The agency can write off on that. But the DoD said, if you don't have an agency sponsoring you, we're not going to tell you 90% is okay. You got to be 100%. So this equivalency became one of the hardest ways to meet FedRAMP requirements, and therefore it doesn't make sense by itself, even if it stays the way it is. But on top of that, it may not even stay. There have been rumors and confirmed by McCune, they're thinking about dumping the equivalency. So beware for anybody you're using who says we're FedRAMP equivalent or we're going down that path.
Chris, if you don't mind, I was going to chime in on the FedRAMP equivalency. One other thing that I've noticed in the ecosystem is more and more snake oil in marketing, right? I say that because what FedRAMP moderate equivalent means is defined in that memo as these particular artifacts as a body of evidence. So that means under an NDA, let's say, you need to be able to provide it to your OSA customers. And so you've got to be transparent. A lot of the product vendors that are cloud services, what they're simply doing is taking their software solution or their tech stack and hosting it in a FedRAMP cloud service that is infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. So, for example, they'll take their software, move it into an Azure government cloud or an AWS government cloud and say, yeah, we meet the requirements, but that's not FedRAMP. FedRAMP goes way deeper into the software code. Things like software bill of materials, static code vulnerability scans on software code, dynamic code scanning, which is penetration testing against the software, is very expensive. It's very, very complex, let alone even in their internal tech stack. Communications between components in their tech stack need to be FIPS validated. So even if a web server is talking to a database server, that has to be FIPS validated traffic. And so FedRAMP is very complex. So challenge them to share that body of evidence if that's a statement they're claiming, and verify that it goes to the level of depth of not just the hosting environment, but also the code and everything in the lower level of what it is their stack is doing.
Critical point. And we've heard it so many times too. If they tell you, yes, I'm on a FedRAMP authorized cloud, that is not good enough. They have to be FedRAMP authorized themselves or equivalent with a body of evidence, as Bowsy said.
And one thing this does for small business that is a major challenge for all of us is there are products and services that are cloud hosted that the government will never buy. So they will never get an agency sponsored to get on the FedRAMP marketplace. Now, I will say there is a push to make FedRAMP more modern, to get more people on the marketplace, not necessarily with a sponsorship, but nothing is out for certain. So if you currently utilize a very specialized niche ERP that the government will never use, you probably need to be discussing moving that onto your own premises and hosting that yourself.
And then again, in the slide deck, we are including this so you guys can reference it, but they are talking about walking it back. We don't know what that looks like for sure. Just stay tuned. Let's talk about policy best practices. And one thing that I want to bring up about IntelliGRC is a feature that could make your life so much easier. And this is also something you should look for in anybody you're hiring as consultants. Can you help me with these policies? They're so critical. They make or break your assessment. It's the number one way to fail. You guys just need to use help. So IntelliGRC, tell us what you've done with that system to help with the policy load.
Yeah, sure. So our approach and solution has been, we've created policy templates for CMMC that we've utilized in joint surveillance assessment. So each time we get a unique perspective through a joint surveillance assessment, we update those templates. And then what we're doing is in our product, we're digitizing it as well. So you can essentially manage all your data points in a GRC tool, and it populates certain sections in your policy. And those sections are typically what they call ODVs or ODPs, stands for organization defined variables or organization defined parameters. So for example, our policies, templates, our strategy has always been keep them high level mandates, right? They should be simply very similar to how you write laws, right? Thou shall not kind of statement. So an analogy that I give folks is policies should read like follow the speed limit. Whereas your processes and your standards, like your baselines, define 45 miles per hour for this road, 25 miles per hour for that road. What that accomplishes is that your policies require less review. Like you're going to still review them annually, at least, usually is best practice, but you don't need to change as much. Like if you decide to purchase a new solution, like a new technology, you don't have to go back and rewrite your policies, right? Instead, you're updating supporting artifacts like your baseline configurations or your procedures, like your SOPs. And so we've tried to basically find that happy medium of, what's the bare minimum that should be in policies? And then what we do is in our policy templates is we have policies structured as subsections. So one for account management is a subsection, and a subsection for password complexities, right? And essentially at the bottom, we always put a RACI chart, right? Which department or role or individuals are responsible for those individual subsections, accountable, consulted, or informed? And some folks are like, okay, what's the difference between responsible and accountable? I always tell folks, accountable is the, you know, for a lack of a better analogy, is whose head is going to be rolling on the ground when shit hits the fan, right? When things go wrong. And that's accountable, right? And usually it's your leadership. It's the CEO, the executives, right? It's not your IT manager who's going to potentially go and get indicted, right? It's the leadership. Unless that's written in that IT manager's job description that you assume the accountability of this. Whereas responsibility is the person who's making sure it's happening consistently and is followed, right? And then what we typically recommend is don't share all your policies to your entire company, right? The likelihood of an entire organization reading hundreds of pages and thousands of words is very small. They're not going to, it's going to be very ineffective. So we always tell folks, focus on the policy statements that across your policy documents, you identify who's responsible and accountable. Those are your bare minimum folks that need to be reading and understanding that policy and owning it. And then for areas where you say there's consultation or informing a person, right? For example, end users need to be informed of best practices. That should go in an acceptable use policy or an employee handbook or rules of behavior. It doesn't matter. Something that each end user has their part, kind of like a shared responsibility matrix. So for example, an example would be if you're in a public Wi-Fi setting, like an airport or Starbucks, make sure you have VPN connected. That's something that in order to accomplish that, you need to inform your end users. And you could put that in the employee handbook or the AUP. And as part of their annual training requirements, that in order for us to, as an organization, comply with some of these requirements, this is your responsibility. Make sure you have that VPN turned on, right? So I always tell folks, that's my strategy in terms of distribution of policy and as well as like how to format those policies.
Some other best practices. That's awesome insight. And Ozzy's platform allows you to minimize as much as you can the load because it's helping you populate these policies rather than really the other solution out there is you go in and painstakingly create these. Now there are templates out there. People are selling these things for CMMC compliance starting at $6,000 and go up from there. I've seen 15 grand packages where they say, here's our templates. We've already made it through an assessment. So they're, they're very valuable and we'll, give you a couple hours of consultation time. Still, those templates are not filled out for your company. And that's what's critical. You can't take a template and just assume you're going to pass an assessment. You've got to build that with the details of exactly how your company does business with exactly the tools that you're using. That's what's got to be written down. So if, for example, that 3 password attempt, that needs to be in a policy somewhere. And if that's how you've configured your settings, you need to show that at this control, which requires a lockout after a certain number of attempts, this is how we do it. And this is the policy that states. So that's all got to be in writing somewhere. This is why policies are so critical. One thing to keep in mind is there are 14 domains in CMMC. We believe in, that doesn't have to be done this way, we believe in 14 policies that mirror that and maybe a couple more, like an acceptable use policy is another common one. But if you have a bunch of policies that don't align with CMMC, you're making your assessor work harder. And so that's a perspective that I think is important to keep in mind is you eventually are presenting this to an assessor. How easy can you make their job to find out what you're doing? Well, you map it as much as you can. So you have 14 policies that exactly map to the 14 domains and all the controls that are in each domain. And you say, okay, here's the policy for acceptable use, or this is the access control policy, and here's the access control domain and all the controls spelled out in the order that I would like to see them in the access control policy. So that's the kind of organization that helps you get through an assessment, helps the assessor. If you help the assessor, you're helping you. And we think it's critical that you rethink your policies. There are some people that are still using archaic policies that have nothing to do with 171. Could you pass? Yeah. Have you made it really, really hard to make a convincing case for your assessor that, oh yeah, it's in there. It's all on page, 47 of this randomly named policy. That's hard to find. So make it as clear as you can that this is it. Let's talk about SSPs in particular as we gear up for breaking out. SSPs have a general guidance that NIST created. Everybody can find that under NIST Special Publication 800-18. Google that and you can go through that, but that doesn't specify specifically for CMMC. That's just everybody who has an information system should have an SSP. That's the general belief. So an SSP, System Security Plan, should be tailored to CMMC if you're going to be working with the DoD. If you're going to sit for an assessment, don't do it without anything, with any other arrangement. It needs to be configured to be the 110 controls as they currently stand. And not just that, but we believe strongly, break them up into every objective. There are 320 objectives. So you should have a lengthy SSP, and we're going to look at these. A lengthy SSP that has 320 descriptions of here's how we do everything that's required for CMMC. And then cross-reference your policies when it is applicable. So what does that mean? All those 14 domains of policies and more that you have, that's where you go into the details of this is exactly how the employees do this, blah, blah, blah. The SSP has a lot of detail. You'll see it, but the policies go even further. This is the implementer. This is the person that does this. This is who shares, the admin privilege once we bring in a new employee. This is the process for doing that. All those things need to be detailed because we're going to need to see it. And the evidence that comes in the form of documentation is the first understanding we get of how you're doing things. So you should have everything documented. And then again, the second form of evidence we will use is interview people. So when you onboard a new employee, tell me what the process is, and that better align. Your policies need to reflect what you're actually doing. And the third way is to actually test it. SSPs, some of the things that go into them, you need to have a revision history. Why? As Ozzy said, it's a good practice for everything to be updated at least annually, but you want to see that. So you have a history of this is all the times that we've gone in and made changes. And if your SSP is 3 years old, that's not a good thing. An assessor is probably not going to like that. What we're looking for is cybersecurity is constantly changing. We want to see ongoing awareness and that you're also always trying to be compliant. So a frequent revision, at least once a year, of here's how we're doing things now, or okay, we added a new department that's touching CUI and here's how we handle them. Everything's got to be reflected in the SSP. If your SSP, by the way, doesn't describe a whole department that's accessing CUI, big problem. You will probably fail the assessment. So you've got to reflect what is happening at your company. And that often means frequent revisions. An executive summary is important in an SSP because this is going to tell the assessor, but anybody who walks in and needs to understand how your network works. Here's the name, here's the cloud service providers that we use, here are all the acronyms you're going to see in here. This executive summary is up at the top so that you're preparing the person for this is what's detailed below. And it could be, our template is over 80 pages. This thing could be a couple hundred pages even as you build in details. So this is up at the top to kind of introduce all the terms and the setting, and then the roles and responsibilities. A RACI chart is great, or here is, who our CEO is, here's who our IT director is. Those kinds of things need to be listed because you want that people are responsible. I want to be able to see the SSP and say, I know I need to interview this person because I see they're responsible for X, Y, and Z. Now, you don't have to do it company-wide. It could be an enclave. Your SSP could just be about the people who are touching FCI and CUI and leave it at that. So maybe, you know, you have some sales department that never touches any of that stuff. I don't need to see that information. Purpose of the system, well, protecting CUI, but list it. Your information system description, and this is where most of the time is going to be spent. You need to show what your system is. Is it something you have built yourself? You're storing all your data internally? Is it a cloud-based system? What's the network architecture? And then a network diagram is the best way to get there. We'll show you an example. Network diagram where you include every single computer, everything that's in there in your system is listed. And there are 4 different types of assets that the CMMC program has identified. We'll talk about all 4 of those assets. That needs to be in your network diagram. Here are 4 different assets and every single item we own and where it falls. What's important in the CMMC process, and we've talked about this a couple times, is scoping. We need to understand the scope of your network, who's on it, who's not allowed to access CUI, and you do that most effectively with a network diagram. So this goes over to the assessor at the C3PAO at the very beginning, and they start to look at this, and only the OSC knows best what their network is. I can't, as an assessor, begin to fathom how you've structured your network. You have to tell me. So the scoping always starts with the OSC. Here's what our network looks like. Here's what we think is in. Here are all the categories. And again, you need some skilled people to help you. This is not something that is intuitive to most companies that, oh yeah, I know exactly what a security protection asset is. And that's this device over here. These are technical terms and it needs to be reflected in your network diagram. So right up front, we know what we're dealing with. And by the way, the lead assessor also has to bless whatever you say your scope is. If they look at this and they say you got it wrong, the assessment cannot go forward. So you really want to have this correct or be able to modify it if the assessor says, no, you got it wrong. Data flow diagram, how do you handle CUI? Does it come from a prime? Does it come from the government? Do you create it internally? And then what happens? And then what happens? And then what do you deliver? So walking through your entire way that you do business, this needs to be reflected in your SSP. And then classifications of assets, we're going to talk about that. You have to understand those. You and your guides need to sit down and think through everything that touches your network. An inventory in your SSP, and you could do it as an exhibit or an attachment, but you want to have a hardware inventory, a software inventory, and all the ports, protocols, and services. Applicable laws, standards, and guidance, that goes in. A security control implementation, this is the longest part. This is where you can take up dozens of pages going objective by objective. Here's how we do this. And why not put it in the order of 171? Because that makes it easier on the assessor. So if your SSP is not designed around NIST 171, you're going to have a hard time. Finally, it's got to be signed by a senior executive. The DoD wants to know, who is it? Who is it that's responsible for this? Whose butt is on the line if they misled us? Let's talk about these in-scope assets. So there are 4 types of assets that we will assess and 1 type that we won't. And we could even spot check that. If it's out of scope and it simply cannot, there's no way possible that it could access your network, your CUI network, that's considered out of scope. But you know what we're entitled to do as assessors? Make sure that that's true. If you tell us a laptop can't access the CUI folders, I'd like to confirm that. And you've said, nope, you don't have to assess that. Well, we have a right to make sure that that's true because it sure looks like that laptop could access the folders if it was configured to. So here are the 4 assets that we do assess. CUI assets, controlled unclassified information assets. This is anything that processes, stores, or transmits CUI. These are your laptops, your workstations. Security protection assets. These are assets that provide security functions or capabilities to the contractor's assessment scope. It does not matter whether or not these assets process, store, or transmit. They're providing a security function. Therefore, the security protection assets. Contractor risk managed assets. This one's a technical one. This could, but it's not intended to, process, store, transmit CUI. So maybe you have a policy, maybe you've locked it down to make it so that it can't in some way, but it could, it's just not intended to. These assets are not required to be physically or logically separated from CUI. It's called a CRMA, or a contractor risk managed asset. We've got specialized assets. These are assets that may or may not process, store, or transmit CUI, such as government property, IoT devices, operational technology, restricted information systems, test equipment. Let's talk about what some of these things are. We all have IoTs in our homes, and so do businesses. So it's maybe a device that is in your boardroom that connects to the internet. Maybe it's some kind of a meeting tool. Operational technology would be, for example, at a CNC shop, most of their machines are operational technology. That's considered a specialized asset. Restricted information systems, test equipment. These are more limited application, but test equipment might be, for example, after we've created a part, a widget, we take it over to the test equipment to make sure it meets the standards that are required for this contract. These are all specialized assets. What do we do? So this is for every one of those four categories, what's going to happen at the assessment, and therefore what you need to think about going into your documentation, because you're going to need to explain this in your SSP. If it's a CUI asset, it gets documented in the asset inventory. That's in your SSP. Document it in the network diagram. You add it as part of the CMMC assessment scope. Prepare to be assessed against the CMMC practices for CUI assets, and the assessor will assess CUI assets against CMMC practices. Will they go to every laptop in your company? No. But will they randomly pick one? Sure. What is an assessor allowed to do? We don't sit down and log into your laptop. That's crossing the line. But what we do is say, hey, Bob, can you open your laptop and demonstrate your 3-password policy? So that's assessing against the CMMC practices, CUI assets. Security protection assets also get listed in the asset inventory and also go into the system security plan. Once again, network diagram, I want to see that in my network diagram. And again, prepare to be assessed against all the practices. When it's time for the assessment, we are going to assess against the practices that are relevant to whatever that SPA does. Contractor risk managed assets. Here again, document it, put it in the SSP, document in the network diagram, prepare to be assessed against CMMC practices. But what we do is we review the SSP. So here, can't emphasize enough why this SSP has to be detailed. 7 pages is not. I'm going to review the SSP, and if it's sufficiently documented, I don't need to do anything further. If I see that the CRMA, for example, hey, this is a laptop that we don't allow anybody to log into CUI. This is how we manage that risk. And I see that fully documented, I don't need to do anything further. If the OSA's risk-based security policies, procedures, and practices, all that documentation or other findings raise questions about it, then I can do a limited check. If I am concerned that they really didn't give me enough information here for me to be convinced, or maybe I had an interview and somebody gave me conflicting information on CRMAs, I might want to go and check it. but otherwise I won't. And then specialized assets. These also, once again, get documented, put them in the SSP, show how these assets are managed using contractors' risk-based security policies, procedures, and practices, document in the network diagram, review the SSP, and then we won't, same thing as before, we won't assess it against other security requirements if it's fairly documented. Anything you want to add to this, Ozzy?
No, I think it was pretty spot on. I mean, just for reference, kind of going back to the statement of 7-page SSPs, on average for JSVAs and DIBCAC assessments, I've noticed firsthand that the typical page length is somewhere between 80 to 120 pages. Like, and that's not saying that's the correct way to do it. That's just a good reference point so that you can evaluate like how prepared you are, how good is your SSP, does it truly cover all these aspects of these 4 asset types, right? These 4 distinct categories of CUI assets, SPAs, etc. And one other thing I was going to add is the contractor risk managed asset changed in the final rule from what was proposed in the proposed rule. In the past, CRMA was intended to not be evaluated against CMMC practices. So that has changed. So interesting enough, I think even in the first year joint surveillances were happening, CRMA was used as a way to basically say, don't evaluate these against the 320 objectives, right? But that has changed. Like, and so I've seen multiple JSVAs where they were able to mark certain things as CRMA. They did address it through their risk management approach and other factors, right? But at the same time, they weren't really dug into against the 320 objectives. And so that's a thing now.
Yep. Question from Taylor, is it a risk vulnerability to outline, and this is relevant to documents, as in a click, hyperlink, links, policy names, et cetera, how to test each of the 320 objectives in the SSP? I don't consider that a risk at all. And Ozzy, maybe you have an opinion on this. In my opinion, the more you can help an assessor link to evidence, the more you've helped them do their job, and you've helped yourself. You've helped prove, here's how we're compliant. You have an opinion on that?
No, I completely agree. Similar to kind of the advice on preparation for an assessment, if your SSP doesn't tell a story that someone can easily digest and follow along, so then it's going to cause problems, right? If you give opportunities where it's too vague or way too specific, it is a balancing act. You give the opportunity to the assessor to drill more into it and ask more questions, right? So finding that balancing act of how much is enough and how much is too little, right, is very difficult. There's no real concrete criteria for that. It usually just comes with experience, right? And so oftentimes I'll tell folks that if your SSP is not able to tell that story and provide coverage for these different asset types, then they're just basically going to raise eyebrows to your assessors. They're going to want to drill in deeper and further. And so the more, the merrier, but also make sure it's digestible, right? Don't overcomplicate things, right? Keep it simple, straightforward. One example is we oftentimes, when helping a customer prepare for an assessment, we'll say your system diagram, for example, should demonstrate a boundary. Your data flow diagram should demonstrate that desired and intended way of handling sensitive data, CUI. And so folks will say, okay, well, how much information should I put in my system diagram? I tell folks, the system diagram does not need to be a network diagram, right? In fact, I think that could be very problematic because it's going to be a lot of overhead to manage and maintain that, right? Where I think it's beneficial is you should have at a high level a depiction of your scope, and for those objects in that diagram, mark them as this is CUI, this is SPA, this is CRMA, this is specialized assets, etc. And the focus is that if your C3PAO assessor can look at that diagram and within 60 seconds or less understand your scope, like, yep, I've seen that before, I know exactly what you look like. That's going to increase your probability of success. But if they're sitting there and they're drilling in it and spending 30 minutes just analyzing it or more, then you're opening up a can of worms.
Yeah, and to be clear, I did say you are going to account for every single laptop, but that's in your inventory. You don't
Yeah.
want that all in your network diagram. That's where you group them together. So all the engineers fall underneath this scope, and this is the assets that they have, et cetera. Then you can make that not the mess that it would be if you literally listed every single asset you have in the
Yeah.
network diagram.
One other thing I was going to mention on the risk and vulnerability aspect of your SSP and any data that goes into pretty much a GRC tool, even, right? In terms of prepping for an assessment, even your evidence. Some folks will ask, what is that data? And I say, well, it's usually not CUI, and it shouldn't be usually, but it is probably security protection data. And so if your product, like a GRC product, is handling all that information, or you're even managing your vulnerabilities, it is, in my opinion, a security protection asset at that point, right? Because
Mine too.
If somebody sees that, they know exactly where your weaknesses lie, and they know how to infiltrate you, right? So to me, you should be protecting it with the same control requirements as best as possible. It doesn't mean it needs to be FIPS validated per se, right? Because that can cause heartaches, right? But try your best to mirror the same level of protection for CUI assets, also for SPAs where possible.
Yes. And this is an important thing too, when you're looking for your GRC tools. I believe everybody should use one. It's going to make your life easier. It's going to help you stay compliant, get compliant, and help you present your evidence. But you need to make sure that this GRC tool that you're using is built by somebody who really knows their stuff. For example, Ozzy's been in the CMMC ecosystem before it existed, in consulting with, and I'd love to, at a later slide here, talk about some of those earlier conversations you had, because that's pretty fascinating stuff. But you need to use a tool that's robust, that allows you to track all this stuff, understands that there are different assets like this, where you can upload these and make sure your job is easier. You can satisfy all these requirements without spending 1,000 hours. One of the things that's most important here, and I want you guys to take away, is work with somebody you can trust. Cyber AB, and I don't know, there it is. The Cyber AB is the certification arm for everybody in the ecosystem. If you want to hire a consultant, you get, and everybody in the div is going to get solicitations. This is how big of an opportunity it is for everybody. Go to the Cyber AB and see if they have credentials, if they know what they're talking about. The credentials start at RP, which is a registered practitioner. Then they have RPA, which is a little bit more educated. The people who sit on assessments, once again, are CCPs and CCAs. Those are the highest levels of certification you can have, and by far the most educated. Can you get a really skilled RP? Yes. Do I think that having somebody who is sitting on assessments or teaching it, or trained at a minimum at the CCP level or CCA, I would not do it any other way, personally. As I've seen some of the advice out there on the side of the assessor, I've seen RPs give bad enough advice that it cost the client $80,000 because they went down a path that it was ill-advised. You got to be careful and get some of the most educated people you can for now, until the ecosystem starts to educate 100% around all the people who are part of it, because those that aren't as educated just aren't getting access to these assessments and understanding all the requirements. And I think that's hurting some of the people in the ecosystem. So look for certifications on Cyber AB. We're going to start gearing toward our breakout session. Brooke, I don't know, maybe closer to noon would be a good time to break out.
So we were going to break out at noon, and I was going to start placing people at 11:55 as we discussed. Did you want to update?
Okay, that sounds great. And we're going to have, by the way, 4 different rooms that we're breaking out into, and you guys, maybe you take a a short amount of time and you get through everything you want to, but we want to offer up all the way until 1 o'clock in these rooms if there are enough questions and things to discuss. How do we get to compliance? There are two major categories here, and the technical implementations is ironically not where most people fail. Most of the people are getting in there and finding tools and solutions that are compliant. It is the policies and procedures, and this is why we're here today. To my knowledge, nobody's ever had an SSP workshop, but I think it's just so important to take away and understand. I want to open this up at this point as we're gearing up to the top of the hour to insights and experiences, lessons learned. Ozzy, you are going to be an awesome resource for this because of the amount of assessments he sat in on. And by the way, he didn't do this because it was required. He did it because he wanted to build a better tool. So when his clients would go through an assessment, he would sit there. And I think that's insightful. And this is also where we're going to do Q&A. So please, guys, if you have some questions now for the group, versus just individual questions related to your SSPs, this is a great time to ask those. I'll start. So Ozzy, what would you say is the most common error? Could you get more specific? The most common error you've seen in assessments?
So other than the only technical one that I like, so on the technical side, there's one that's a common repeat offender. There's actually probably two main ones. The two main ones I always come across is the FIPS validated cryptography, which is very difficult to achieve. The second one I always come across is MFA and its implementation at the sources where it needs to be implemented. So like at times you'll hear an argument saying, well, at the entry point to the information system, it's MFA'd, but everything after the fact is not, once you're in a trusted network. And so that historically caused some heartburn to some C3PAOs. But the biggest, even bigger than that, so non-technical issues that I've noticed, and I'd say is even probably the biggest offender, is the auditable paper trail needed to show processes being followed. Like oftentimes people invent their policies and procedures, say a month before their assessment, and there's no paper trail to show that it's being followed. You know, and that's a huge issue that I see. So, you know, that's why you always hear folks saying, get started now, get started sooner, is because you need to start generating a paper trail. That's what's getting verified, right? That's what's getting looked at. You know, so that's what I always tell folks. And then I always get into situations where like in that requirement to have a paper trail for procedures, people say, well, what things needs the procedures and what's enough and what's too much? Right? I always tell folks, well, you should have some flavor of coverage across all 320 objectives. And your catch-all for that is maybe an annual internal assessment, right? And that'll make sure you have coverage for all 320. But for the things that might need to happen more frequently, pay attention to two key factors. One is requirements that need to be followed at a defined frequency. Once a month, I patch. Once a month, I vuln scan. Once a week, I review account permissions, right? Once a quarter, I verify training completion, whatever it is, right? And those things I call time-based requirements, right? Those are things that you can tie to a time base and be able to point and say, well, this is an annual requirement, so I'm going to have a piece of evidence for you to look at least once a year, right? The second factor is event-based requirements. If you want something and you have a certain risk appetite in mind, that you want some things followed consistently in a repeatable way, and it's based on an event such as a new hire, a new acquisition of a technology solution, terminating an employee, right? Those things should be like checklists, like an SOP checklist that you follow a process and it gets filled out by those stakeholders that are involved in that hiring or that termination. And there's your paper trail for that. And those things are triggered by an event, right? And so I always tell folks, those are the two drivers for deciding when you need some kind of procedure artifact or a paper trail artifact.
We got a question for you, Ozzy, from Taylor. Can you elaborate on the MFA topic? When would it not be acceptable to have one MFA login and drop the requirement within the trusted network?
Yeah, so if you look at the objectives, right, the related objective says that privileged accounts for local and network access is leveraging MFA. So for example, local, if you're on a laptop and that person has a second administrator account to perform an admin function on that laptop, the moment that they are creating an authentication session to that laptop using their privileged account, that needs to be challenged by a multi-factor authentication solution, right? And then both non-privileged users and just standard users, for anything that goes over a network, whether it's going through your wireless adapter, your Wi-Fi adapter on your laptop, or even an Ethernet cable, that needs to be, and then the other side being a resource, right? That needs to be MFA'd as well. And so a lot of folks kind of miss that point in that they'll have it for just the login to the laptop, but they won't have it for a remote desktop session to a different device, right? Or they won't have it when they go into a SharePoint site, right? And that can be problematic, right? And I've seen that become a finding.
So I am attempting to share, hopefully it came up. Can everybody see the CMMC assessment guide? Great.
Yes.
This is one of the controls that is directly related to MFA. And this is what your consultants, if you have one, should be helping you with, understanding every one of these. And the Bible, as I call it, for assessors is this assessment guide. This is what we are walking into assessments and referring to make sure we get it right. This is our guidance, and this comes straight from the DoD. This is what the DoD has put together to say, this is how you need to run your assessments. This is what you're looking for. And by the way, it actually comes from NIST. And NIST 171 is this, and 171A is where you find all of the objectives. And then this discussion is from industry experts coming together and saying, this is what this really means. Every one of these controls will have a discussion, a further discussion, and potential assessment considerations. This is what we all try to just know like the back of our hand, so that when we come in, we can correctly identify whether or not this is being done. But you'll get all kinds of examples here. This is what I think anybody in the audience who wants to start to understand CMMC, know that this document exists. If you want to get more of this, Brett, if you want to find this, I'm going to give you a resource page in this slide deck and a couple more slides, but also it's at the CMMC site that the DoD is dedicated, which is actually.
Hey, Chris, I want to weigh in on that multi-factor real quick. I'm from the position that I think the more factors, the better. So we tend to think of multi-factor authentication as our phone beeping or asking for a code from Duo or Authenticator. And that is certainly one. However, if you're in the Windows environment, and Google has something similar, if you're the Windows Hello concept will gain its multi-factor authentication oftentimes from other factors other than your phone. And so that leaves the end user thinking to themselves, why I didn't get prompted? It's not working. It's only a single factor. Typically, the standard is something you have, something you know, something you are. So in like a Windows scenario, using Windows Hello, they're using a risk-based sign-on that Microsoft is analyzing. And so they might say, coming from the same IP address, same certificates on the computer, they knew the PIN and they had a biometric reading therein. And oftentimes, once you're in that gateway, then it might even drop the risk a little lower. So it's not such a cut and dry procedure anymore. And, eventually we will learn to trust the technology or not. I have most of my clients that I've worked with that we've configured, we tend to just throw it all on there. So even if Windows is doing their thing, their phone's still popping with that factor.
And I think that's a great point, John. I think even in going back to Taylor's question, that's why I think it's important to work with a expert, right, or a consultant. A consultant's not just someone who understands, and this is why it may be multiple consultants involved. It's not just understanding CMMC and its nuances. It's also understanding the tech stack, the technology. So for example, if you authenticate to a computer on a LAN in an office environment and your login to Windows is challenged with MFA, and let's say there's a file server in the office, and you have a file explorer session to open a file share on the file server, that does not technically need to be challenged with MFA. Why? Because now you understand the fundamental of how authentication in an Active Directory environment, for example, works, right? If it's Kerberos based, that token that was issued to you, your driver's license to operate on the network post MFA challenge, is a session between you and a domain controller or a directory service. And that is the one that carries on that session to the file server share and your laptop, right? So it's basically the issuance of a driver's license per se, right? As an analogy or a token, an authentication token. The issuance is what requires that challenge. So having a consultant who understands how different authentication mechanisms work for different technologies is why that's important to then answer these lower fundamental questions of how much is enough and where do I need to apply it?
Joe has another question for you, Ozzy. During the assessment of signatories of policies, are the signatories usually executives? If so, are they responsible for knowing every technical aspect of the policy they sign? I have an opinion on that too, but go ahead.
Sure. So in CMMC, it's not a hard requirement that a signature exists. That's not an actual objective that can be, prescribed. It is a best practice though, right? So most people do it out of the best practice aspect, right? Because they may want to truly operationalize a better security posture. And so what we've done typically is with that RACI chart concept, right? For each policy, we embed a RACI chart and we say the roles that are accountable and responsible, normally those are the folks we recommend be the signature authorities. At a minimum, those that are accountable, right? Because they basically are signaling to the rest of the organization that this is a mandate that I have co-signed and authorized, right? And it also then increases the probability of folks following it as well.
And I'll elaborate on that. There is actually a process, we call it limited deficiency practice, where in CMMC, if we come across a document that's not signed, we won't fail you, but we will say, you need to go get it signed. So although not required, that's typically what we teach that you look for, and you can ask for during an assessment for some of these limited deficiencies to be corrected. And that's the example that's normally brought up is, the executive didn't sign it, here's the spot, and we just want to have a document that actually illustrates the executive did sign off on this. So while you won't find an objective that says it's signed, it's kind of taught that we're looking for those things. So it's definitely a best practice.
And I just realized the second half of the question, which is, if it's an executive who signs it, are they responsible for knowing every technical aspect of the policy that they sign? Not necessarily, right? So the best practice that I typically advise is very similar to what you'll learn when you take a CISSP boot camp, right? Your job as a security practitioner, whether it be your consultant who's that role or someone in-house, is to identify risks and inform leadership, right? And they teach you that in CISSP. So they may not need to know how vuln scans are conducted and the specific nuances, but what they need to know is the risk to their business, right? You need to communicate to them that the outcome of this policy is vulnerabilities are being managed properly and they're not adding up. And the risk that we're addressing here is, the threat vectors that vulnerabilities leave behind. So you may be able to, in your own term, you translate it for your executives to understand, because if they're ultimately accountable and they would go to a court proceeding or get indicted, they need to know the risk. And it's our job as practitioners to inform them of that risk.
We're coming up on
about
3 hours.
1 minute.
Yeah. I just love that we have so much content that the people here can share, that we can pack 3 hours plus. Thanks everybody for the marathon session today. Here are some resources. These will all be clickable on the packets you'll receive, so you don't have to write these down or anything. But let's talk about them. There's Project Spectrum that's set up by the DoD for CMMC specifically to help you out. CyberAB Marketplace, we talked about that. Go to cyberab.org, click on the Marketplace, top right. The CMMC page, we had a question about that. There's where you find that. Here's the final rule and the proposed rule for 48 CFR. The final rule is the technicals that we talked about today. The proposed rule is the one that just finished the comment period. We anticipate first quarter. We have an SSP template. We're going to bring them up in our classes today. You can go ahead and go to this link and pull down your own. It's a Word version. We haven't done anything to make it hard on you. We want you to have a good working template to get started with. And by the way, that's usually something a lot of people charge for. We just think it needs to be out there. And then the assessment tool, this is something that we use regularly. It's a spreadsheet, and we send it to our clients regularly. What it will help you understand is what are all the objectives? What are these 110 controls, and what are all the objectives? You will be receiving a recording as well of this to answer the question that just came in. But the assessment tool can hopefully give you some information there on what is this all about. That doesn't mean you can do this yourself. I think everybody here would highly advise you get somebody trained internally or find somebody who is trained to help you with this. Thanks, Jeff.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for the first part of that. That was absolutely fantastic. I have actually been compiling the breakout rooms while we were finishing up here. So as you can see on the screen, there is the contact information for the team from Miracat, and that will also be sent to you after, as well as the links from the chat, anything important you might need.